Let me ask you this. We've talked a little bit about the importance of power storage. What about waste to energy? Where do you guys see the trend there? Biomass and things of that. What do you see as the trends? Is there money being invested in it? Are the technologies coming about? Anybody?
Well,
yeah.
I don't want to monopolize, but as to energy storage, we have our largest investment is in a company that has developed the lowest cost, most efficient energy storage system for grid-level applications. And it's being employed today to front wind farms and to stabilize the energy coming off of wind farms and photovoltaic projects into the grid. This company is going to be huge. It's already got hundreds of millions of dollars of backlog. I mean, we have a company called ICE Energy, which has just signed a $125 million contract to provide thermal storage systems to 15 utilities here in Southern California. So storage is the answer. We and other venture capitalists are trying to invest in those kinds of companies and provide those answers. We just invested in a wastewater treatment company that serendipitously we found could turn this sludge that we get out of treating wastewater into energy because it's high BTU stuff. It's mostly tissue paper, and so that's very high BTU, and you can gasify it, turn it into a syngas, or you can run it through a generator, create electricity. So waste to energy is going to be, I think, will be huge. Michael and I were having a small conversation earlier about the so-called Valley of Death, where I've seen literally dozens of waste to energy technologies and projects in the last 2 years where the companies have built 5 to 10 ton per day demonstration units, now want to go out into the commercial world and build a 50 or 100 ton a day commercial project, and there's no money. I heard that there was some money from DOE for some of those. I just haven't seen it employed yet. But there's dozens of these companies that are stalled waiting for somebody to lend them the money to do their first commercial plant. And I think if the DOE or anybody else in federal government is going to do anything, they should get out there and provide the money for those unproven plants. They won't all work, but we'll prove out 4 or 5 or 6 technologies that do work, and then people will start building waste-to-energy plants all over this country.
I think that I don't think you pick any one of these. We have a waste-energy plant in Long Beach, which has been there for a long time.
Right.
And one of the difficulties is you start running in against, well, are you now impairing recycling as a result? Are people now throwing stuff away so it can be burned? There are issues with it. I think it's certainly going to be part of the system. But to answer the larger question you asked, I think everyone ought to be realistic about what's going to come down from for federal government for sure, and clearly from state government. That pipe with federal money is going to shrink substantially. And I've got this right directly from the president on down. There's a conversation with him about a year ago in which he told the mayors that, you can expect these stimulus dollars for 18 months, maybe 2 years, a little more, but then the tap's going to get turned off. And the idea is Keynesian, pump up the public sector while the private sector gets a little healthier, and then hopefully private sector takes over. And I think it will. I happen to know ICE Energy very well, for example, and the storage issue, what's going to happen since you have such a huge forcing function with standards and other issues on renewables all over the country, not just California, but particularly in California. Things like waste energy, being more efficient, coming up with storage systems, coming up with more efficient and cheaper catalytic converters on all kinds of equipment, which is happening now. All those things. The market is so much more efficient at this stuff than government is. And let's be candid. We're going to waste a lot of money here. I said this last year, and that's okay. I agree with you. If we're going to waste money. That's what happens in new areas. But if we get an industry out of it, if we get an electric vehicle industry, if we get a battery industry, if we get a renewable system, a electric system with a high percentage of renewables that functions well, it's worth it. But eventually the private sector is going to take this over, and you cannot replicate the millions of decisions and the millions of really smart people out there who figure out ways to do it better. And I believe that. I've seen it operate over and over again. Not to say government isn't important and can't help, but we've got to be realistic. The deficits in this country are such, and clearly the deficit in the state is such, that public money is going to shrink. It just has to shrink because we have to fix and repair our balance sheet, not only here but at the national level. So let's prepare for that. Take advantage of the funds while they're here. Let's move as quickly as we can. Every part of stimulus money we get, we use immediately in Long Beach. I know it's not going to be here, and we try to use it as wisely as we can for things that are going to produce things down the road and better the city from a variety of perspectives. But I know some of the people he's talking about. They're very smart people. Just to give you an example, ICE Energy came up with a very simple idea, which is let's take intermittent power. Wind, for example, would produce very little wind gets produced on peak when you really need it. So the power has less value. And it's hard for the system to integrate intermittent. You know, the wind doesn't blow, turbines aren't moving. It's real simple. Sun's not out, photovoltaics aren't working. So what they do is they produce ice at night in a commercial air conditioning unit for a commercial building, and then use that ice during the day to cool the structure. Very simple proposal. But it's taken, as he would argue, and as I would argue, energy at very, very low prices, helping the utility system actually keep some of their plants online, making use of renewable power that's intermittent. In effect, it's a storage device. It takes electrical energy and turns it into thermal energy. And it does it fairly efficiently at about 98%, if I remember. So those things make sense. You know, that was a very concept that's been around forever.
Well, it's a 20-year overnight success.
Yeah, I know the history of the company. I know Frank very well, for example. Okay,
Michael, I was going to call on you. I thought you were going to respond to Dave's comment about the Valley of Death, but now we could also think of it in terms of the state of California, I guess. So,
the Valley of Death Valley.
Well, I think there's 2 points that I would say in terms
beyond the Valley of Death,
and a little bit of a soapbox. So you asked a question in terms of waste to energy. So one of the questions is, what is energy? If you look at the classic investment in Cleantech, whether it be PV or battery storage or things of that sort, energy has been wind turbines. Energy has been defined as electricity. The reality is that 80% of the world's energy consumption is in the form of heat. In the last panel, it was discussed at $100 billion in terms of heating and cooling. So it's certainly a biased perspective. We're developing technologies that really concentrate on the heat side as opposed to electricity side. The paybacks are there. The paybacks are absolutely there. I mean, we're dealing with technologies that have paybacks between six months to a year, unsubsidized. Doesn't care what the CO2 policy is, doesn't care about government subsidies, feed-in tariffs, et cetera. So I think that's one aspect in terms of answering your question. The other, which is in terms of ice bear, is, and that actually also leans towards a little bit in terms of thermal solution. Thermal storage is a fraction of the costs as compared to electrical storage. So I don't know what the cost structure is of extreme power, but the cost of energy storage on a thermal basis is close to free. So the ability to store, whether it be ice or the ability to store thermal energy from the sun, and then convert a solar PV to a solar thermal that actually can run 24/7 and not have the expense of batteries or things of that sort, does change the overall economics significantly.
I'm going to ask one more question of Jeremy. Our time's about to run out, but let me ask you three while I'm talking to Jeremy. If there's any point you wanted to make that we haven't brought out yet, give you one last chance to make the point. Jeremy, I was just curious if there was any lessons learned that you could share with us about the decision process that Tesla went through in deciding to go to Fremont, and anything that I don't know if Eric Garcetti is still here, but anything that we could learn.
They're not going to Downey?
Well, I think the simple answer is that the new Tesla factory was built purposed to put cars on the road, and the rebranding and not repurposing of a non-automotive factory, it's time. We can get cars on the road quite a bit faster by putting in the most advanced machines in a factory that's already been built for automotive.
That's all you want to say?
The longer answer could go a little bit more into what I believe Eric, the president of the LA City Council, was talking about.
Okay. Yeah, very diplomatic. David, any last thoughts, or Michael? We cover everything?
Well, I just would say that in terms of, I think Cleantech is an excellent place to be. To David's point, as long as we could not look at artificial environments such as ethanol or things of that sort, there are great opportunities that are cost-effective under their own weight and don't depend on outside forces to make it happen.
Okay. Mayor?
Probably going to sound a little strange for somebody in the political world to say this, but I think we ought to be very careful, and I think ethanol is a great example, and I think some of the renewable portfolio standard proposals are another one of political leadership that just throws stuff against the wall and says, we're going to go here. Ethanol is a great example of how not thinking through the consequences and not thinking through for other markets and just trying to, say you did something and then walk away from it. They've got to move from that political kind of leadership, in maybe the worst sense of that word, to sustainable leadership, where you actually do care about making something work, and you have to have a time horizon that's 15 or 20 years, not 18 months. And that's, I think, a disease that occurs in this state and maybe even in this country. And everyone out there ought to be very leery when you see that, because we will waste even more money, and worse than that, we won't achieve our goals. I'm in a political world now, so I understand this maybe more than I did before. And I think a sustainable leadership framework, which thinks long-term, is really important. One of the best examples of definition of leadership, it's kind of odd, from political leadership, comes from Casey Stengel, the old baseball manager. Some of you may have remembered that name. And Casey used to say that the art of leadership was keeping the 50% of the people who hated you away from the undecided. and I love that quote, because that's kind of what people in political life do. You kind of move in that and try to keep in the middle and try to make sure you try to satisfy folks. But the one thing I've noticed from my business to my political life has been that the lack of a long-term view, the lack of thinking 10, 15, 20 years down the road is sorely lacking. And I would just urge everyone, put people's feet to the fire. Make sure that they think through the consequences and say, okay, what's going to happen 10 or 15 or 20 years from now? And I don't want somebody to say, well, I won't be in office then. It doesn't matter, because sometimes you do hear that. I just call it, for lack of a better term, a sustainable leadership framework needs to be really imprinted on everybody out there.